Hello to all. I'm here today in the brand new Tier 6 German premium aircraft carrier, the Erich Loewenhardt, named after a famous World War I German aviator. Now she appears in World of Warships as a Tier 6 premium aircraft carrier on a rather unique hull. Not quite sure what it's based upon, but it is a prototype for the design that would become the Graf Zeppelin found in the game as a Tier 8. The Loewenhardt is a Tier 6, however, so does sit at a tier where matchmaking is a bit different and carrier impact is a bit different. Now first off, you will note her aircraft. She is at this moment the only carrier in the game to mount the Stuka, if I'm not mistaken, so you do have the infamous, for better or worse, Stuka as your primary strike aircraft, along with a Messerschmitt. In this case, a Messerschmitt 109T, the navalized variant, as her planes. Now, as a German carrier, she has a German carrier loadout, so she has rocket planes with AP rockets, that's the Bf-109T, and then torpedo bombers, and in this case, HE dive bombers, unlike the tech tree German carriers that you've probably been seeing for a bit now. Now the Loewenhardt has an HE dive bomber. So just some basics before we go over into a game. The overall hull of the Loewenhardt is, well, it's not great. It's pretty standard for low tier carriers, so essentially unarmored, although the citadel space is fairly small. If I strip away the armor here, you'll see the citadel is rather tiny and relatively waterline. And underneath a turtleback. So pretty difficult to citadel, although she does take consistent HE damage. Hit point wise at 46,000, it's nothing special, but it's pretty decent for the tier. Pretty standard, 16% torpedo reduction, so she does have some torpedo bulge. Secondary wise, she does not have Graf Zeppelin secondaries, so don't get your hopes up, but with AFT and secondary flag, you can get it up to a respectable 6.3 kilometer range, and so the secondaries are serviceable for defending yourself. If you look here, she has 505mm dual-purpose mounts that also serve as AA, so these are mounted on the side with the island on the right, so your right side secondaries are a bit more potent than your left side secondaries. But in addition to that, she has 8 spawn-son mounted twin 6-inch turrets, just like the Graf Zeppelin, just without the improved dispersion found on the Graf Zeppelin. So pretty decent secondary armament, but it lacks the range and accuracy of the Graf Zeppelin. AA-wise, 190, pretty decent for a Tier 6 carrier. It's not the highest at all, but notice that a large amount is mounted on the long-range mount that reaches out to 5.2 kilometers, so she has a fair amount of AA, just nothing special. Now maneuverability, she is actually one of the fastest carriers in the game. She does 35.8 knots, but default, and with a speed flag she can reach about 37 knots, which does make her one of the fastest carriers in the game. In spite of that though, she does have a rather large turning circle of 1,140, so carrier levels of turning circle even if you are fast, and a relatively poor rudder shift. Concealment with Concealment Expert is 11.8, so far below the, I believe, 8.8 that the Ryuho reaches, but well below that of the Ranger. So kind of middling in terms of detection and overall survivability. Now enough of the carrier hull itself. We'll go over the planes before we go in. So she has 9 plane squadrons, which have 6 plane attack flights. The attack aircraft HP is 1420, which is relatively low for the tier. Still beats out the zeros that you might find on the Ryuho. Or actually, it doesn't even beat those out. It has about the same as the Ryuho's A6M0, but note that the A6M0 restores rocket planes in 55 seconds, whereas the Loewenhardt restores them at a rather hefty 68 seconds in comparison. And across the board, 85 seconds on the torpedo bombers and 80 seconds on the dive bombers. Means that these are above average regeneration times with pretty below average reserves of 9 aircraft per plane type. The HP is also fairly low. You get kind of Japanese levels of HP, but without the Japanese short regen. In exchange, however, your planes are exceptionally fast. You can see here that the attack aircraft cruise at 157 knots with this build, and boost up to 198. The torpedo bombers boost to 177 and cruise at a more pedestrian 136, but the dive bombers are extremely fast, with 160 knot cruising and 201 knot maximum boost speed. Attack aircraft in, as I said, flights of 6. Each plane carries 4 rockets, and these are the AP rockets with 2300 alpha, give or take. Nothing remarkable there. Torpedo bombers have 4200 alpha, so actually fairly decent, very similar to that of the Graf Zeppelin. Now, she's two tiers lower, so 4200 compared to the Graf Zeppelin's 53. But for this tier, she's fairly decent. A little bit better than the Wesser at this tier. However, in exchange, the torpedoes are exceptionally slow. They do have good range. With torpedo acceleration, they still have 4.8 kilometers range, but they only reach 39 knots with the module and torpedo acceleration. But the squadron that really shines or stands out on this carrier, as you will see in game, is the dive bombers. They only have just shy of 2,000 hit points, and they are extremely fast, but they each carry a 1,000 pound bomb with a 12,200 alpha with 68 millimeters of penetration. Now they attack in flights of 2 in a squadron of 6, so that's 3 attacks potentially. But just for context, with 12,000 alpha, that puts each bomb as more alpha than a midway bomb. Now you're still not going to outdamage a midway, but that is merely because the midway drops 6 bombs to your 2. Overall, each bomb does a pretty hefty 4,000 damage and has a pretty good fire chance and HE penetration. And these are kind of the bread and butter of the ship. Now the reticle of the dive bombers, as you will see in game, is a bit different from those of the tech tree ships. The tech tree ships have a AP dive bomber, which has a reticle similar to those of the Japanese APDBs, but the Loewenhardt has a circular reticle, more akin to that of the Graf Zeppelin, with her APDBs. However, unlike the notoriously unreliable APDBs of the Graf Zeppelin, the Loewenhardt's HEDBs are actually relatively consistent, which I will hopefully be able to show you once we get into a match. So queuing up, there's quite a bit here. Now, tier 6 carriers are in a relatively spicy position. When you're bottom tier against tier 8s, you do see some fairly potent ships, but when you're top tier as a tier 6 and seeing tier 5s, carriers are relatively monstrous. So for our first demonstration match, we'll see what we can find. And yes, I did not go over my captain build, but we'll go over that probably after this match, just to get things going and get the ball rolling without sitting in port for too long. Pretty long queue time. Lots of carriers in the queue, so the matchmaker is struggling somewhat to put us into a match. But we'll see what we can do about that. Fairly lengthy queue. Now, I haven't really featured a German carrier on my channel, but that's because I wasn't fortunate enough to get any of the drops. So I'm working from square one with the Rhine, just like many of you. But overall, the German carriers do seem interesting. Rhine is pretty strong for tier 4, but most tier 4 carriers are. Weser, on the other hand, seems to be a bit underpowered outside of being very potent against battleships, in my opinion, and in my experience. But I think once you get to the Augustus Percival and the Manfred von Richthofen at tier 10, they are fairly potent carriers. But we'll get to that when we actually go over them in their own matches. In the meantime, we are in a double carrier match at tier 5 and 6, so we are in quite a monstrous position. Ranger, Weser are our opponents, Ismail, New York, Pensacola, London, Alba, Königsberg, so a fair amount of cruisers to test out the rockets on, and then a couple of destroyers, which are normally somewhat difficult for the tech tree carrier Weser to handle, but the Loewenhardt tends to handle them just fine. Anyhow, on these low tier maps, my speed is an extremely good asset, especially with the relative lack of AA. I'm actually going to position a bit to the side. So you can see the reticle for the AP rockets is fairly elliptical along the horizontal axis, kind of like a stretched out Havar axis. And it does sit a little further. So with HE rockets, typically your reticle will be about here, so you are aiming a little further out in comparison. Maneuverability wise, the planes are actually quite maneuverable. Now they bleed through speed fairly quickly, but they do have an extra engine cooling consumable charge when compared to carriers of other nations. So overall handling of most German aircraft is fairly good, unlike that of the Graf Zeppelin with her TA-152s, which handle kind of like whales in the sky, really. They're very fast, but only in a straight line whenever you have to turn, well, difficulties arise. Looking for a cruiser to hit and not a destroyer because of the nature of my AP rockets. There's that London over there, which would be rather pleasant to hit, but I can't really find a target at this moment, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump some rockets into the side of this unarmored Ranger instead. So the reticle is fairly far out. As you can see, the Ranger's Citadel is right under the engine space there. I aimed a little bit high, but 2 Citadels does put 8,000 in. So the AP rockets, when they do Citadel damage, do actually put in some significant work. When they don't, however, they can be a little difficult to work with. None of my planes make it out thanks to their low hit points, and I have 2 destroyers to contend with, launching the dive bombers. Now you see that small circular reticle and the raised altitude of the German bombers in comparison. There's that enemy Nicholas. So there is some significant hang time, so you have to lead a little bit. I underlead. But for destroyers with the Loewenhardt, it's actually best to go from the side at about 1.8 kilometers is about the aim distance. So I'm leading, thinking about where he's going to be rather than where he is now. And the bombs quite consistently go toward the center of the reticle. Unfortunately for me, I don't quite get the aim right. The bombs are really much more suited for larger targets. So I get some incapacitations by splashing bombs into the water beside these targets, but I'm unable to finalize my Devonshire going down because he's full broadsiding. Nicholas seems to be turning in response to some torpedoes, or actually I guess he didn't have last stand. He's going to abort. Now the torpedo bombers are the slowest squadron, do a fair amount of damage as far as German torpedoes go, but they're really nothing special and not particularly great when you compare them against the likes of, say, the Ryuhos. Almost 8,000 damage alpha torpedoes. Handling wise, however, they do turn quite excellently. Their high speed means you do overshoot targets quite fairly, or fight quite readily. Gonna have to aim a little blind here. But I did score a flooding. Nope, I'm gonna hide from the Ismail. Managed to hit one more bomb onto the London, but the enemy carrier, or one of the enemy carriers, drops a fighter. I'm gonna relaunch with the JU-87Cs at this point. Now notice my extreme speed allowing me to cross this low tier map very quickly, which is one of the key assets. So this guy just took some floods and looks like he DCP'd. Russian Damcon. Now, because of the reticle, you can't actually see where you're aiming if you're dodging flak. So if you're aiming, you also can't see where the flak puffs are spawning, so it can be somewhat dangerous. The bombs very consistently glide towards the center of the reticle, and 2 quick penetrations for 8,000 damage. No fire, however, so we're going to go back for another shot. And you can see they sail quite consistently toward the center of the reticle. So versus large targets, the Loewenhardt has no problem at all stacking damage and stacking dots in this case, since we know he did use his DCP. Gonna pursue with the torpedo bombers. They're slower aircraft in comparison, but 177 knots is nothing to scoff at. Plenty of boost charges left, so we're gonna advanced. Now they're not particularly stealthy, but the arming distance is decently short, I think, where I might be able to hit this Ismail. Gonna need him to turn out a little bit, but I might hit that forward torpedo. Oh, nope, a little too close. So unfortunately my poor aim does short the torpedo. Pretty good turning, sir. Now at 39 knots, these are the slowest aerial torpedoes, or amongst the slowest aerial torpedoes. So even a battleship can be difficult to hit if you don't have the proper lead. Do follow up with one bomb. I'm just gonna focus down the Ismail here because he's all alone and vulnerable. Now he has his damage control back up, but combined with the efforts of my allies here, I should be able to put him down with just HE bomb damage. You can see my reserves are fairly low after making some attacks and losing some HEDBs already, kind of dropping down. Again, you have to be careful with the high altitude flak. And again, with the easy lead times on a battleship, as long as they're still in the reticle space, you'll tend to hit your bombs. Another easy 8,000 damage and a fire, thanks to that 69% fire chance per bomb. And another quick 2 bombs. He's starting to saturate, which is why the damage isn't as great. But we'll make do. London creeping around over there. He's being harassed a little bit by my allied ranger, who unfortunately fails to secure enough damage. So not a great angle of approach there. Looks like I briefly spotted and shot it. Don't have boost here, so my torpedo bombers are moving quite slowly toward the target. Plenty of bombs left, however, but we're gonna use the full-up rockets and see if we can't put some AP citadels. Do you manage to land a torpedo onto the Alba? Now remember, we have fairly good turning circles, so I'm just gonna find the right spot, and with Favars, of course, you want that broadside target. Aiming quite far out because of the way the AP rocket's reticle works. I'm looking to get the broadside, and my rockets, of which I land 8, combined with the efforts of my ranger with the HE bombs, does quickly dispatch that London. Go after the ranger's side. Now do note there's a significant lead time to the rockets, but if you lead properly, you'll get rewarded like so. I'm gonna try and move up here. Ranger protecting himself with a fighter, so we'll go after the Alba. Now, cruiser would normally be somewhat difficult to go after in comparison, but remember Loewenhardt has a circular reticle, which doesn't particularly care. I give him some lead time. There's some hang, but very easy to land at least one bomb even on a small target, like the Alba. Gonna boost away from the Ranger and glide back toward the Ismail. Turns out we're gonna be having quite the spicy game. As you can see, their dodging flaps become somewhat difficult. Launching fairly early. A little off to the side with that reticle, but not to worry. Still do manage to score a fire at the very least. And at this point, the Ismail should be fairly easy to dispatch, even with my relatively slower torpedo bombers. Looks like I'm going to have a lot of killing ahead of me if I want to stay competitive in this game. Again though, you can see my relatively long regeneration times along with my low plane reserves does mean that over the course of a longer match like this, 11 minutes I guess is what you would consider a longer match in modern warships, as sad as it is to say, you can suffer somewhat. 3.5 kilometers of distance. Now the reticle is, for the torpedo bombers, is fairly straight, about the same as the Japanese, but it does take a significant amount of time to narrow. So if you have the aim perk on your captain, I always forget the name of the skill, but the one that reduces aim time, the Graf Zeppelin doesn't normally take it, but the Loewenhardt certainly would appreciate it, for both her dive bombers and her torpedo bombers. Ismail is healing, but hopefully if I can land 3 bombs, he should drop. So 2 quick bombs for a quick kill. And now most carriers would be reluctant to punch through a carrier-borne fighter to hit this ranger. But I am doing almost 200 knots. So if I time this properly and I wait for the fighter to orbit away from me, so that it doesn't lock onto me too quickly, I should be able to theoretically get onto the target and release a bomb. Able to release a bomb, score a fire. Defending myself here, and I'm going to launch the rockets because the Ranger hull is nice and broadside. Plenty of boost charges left, so I'm going to boost over with my 200 knot rocket planes. Nope. Can I snatch up that kill? Not quite. Oh, that's a shame, but I'm going to look for the Pensacola. The Western hasn't moved his hull. But you can see very easily racking up 6-digit numbers over the course of this longer match. He's over there. Now remember, I have that longer reticle, which does allow you to do some pretty neat stuff if you use mountains, but in this case it means I cannot approach him from this particular position because he's too close to cover. Now he's a bit angled. You'll note the Pensacola is also one of the strongest AA ships at the tier, I believe the strongest AA ship. So even a faint bit of angling against the AP rockets does result in ricochets. This is something you have to be careful of. I'll cruise outside of his AA range and get a bit of a lead on him, and then turn in. That way at least I can turn him away from my destroyer in the cap. Oh, he pops defensive fire, and his fighter might lock me, but I have the advantage of speed on my side. Quick citadel there. He does dodge my Icarus's torpedoes. Just controlling the pace of the match. Now remember, my torpedoes are very slow, but the Pensacola is not particularly fast, so even with fairly minimal lead, it should be elementary to guarantee a hit. Pretty standard tactic of turning him into the torps, and then now that he's nice and broadside, and in this case taking a bow torp, we can go for the actual accurate hit that we're looking for. Now theoretically, because of the long cruising distance of the torpedoes, you can shoot them off from far away, but we're not going to bother with any fancy tricks. Especially versus a cruiser that's more of an anti-battleship tactic. And even then it's somewhat risky since all the low-tier battleships, while slow, have fairly good rudder shift in exchange. Again, boosting toward the Pensacola. Have to outrace him, be a little bit ahead. He's going to see me, so he's going to react. He's also turning out against a Ranger dive bomber, so... Oh, my hull, by the way, has been taking some consistent damage, but nothing significant enough to actually kill me. Looks like he's going to turn back in. So in anticipation of this, we're actually going to follow, and looks like he is in fact turning. which does allow me to quite easily dispatch him. Wester's still in the exact same spot. The Wester uses a hipper hull, by the way. He's a little slower than me in terms of hull, but 32 knots for a carrier hull is still pretty respectable. And more importantly, he's more detectable with that tall mast. And he has a turtle deck, which I cannot really punch through. My torpedo bombers, however, should be able to make quick work of him. My fighter, or his fighter, got absorbed by that first rocket attack. We're encroaching on 120,000 damage, and the high speed of my planes means that I get to put in lots of damage. Even though I'm a fair distance away from his hull. Now obviously this guy's not the brightest player since he hasn't even moved his hull the whole match, but it's alright. 4-plane fighter, looks like I still took too long, so I could actually launch from outside of fighter range if I wanted to. Since he's not moving. But we're just gonna relaunch considering the situation. My torpedoes finally contact, thanks to their slow 39 knot speed, and he's pretty spotted at 1400 and could earn an air defense expert from my self-defense protocols. The not moving Wester takes another aerial torpedo, and now I'm racing against my destroyer's HE DPM, which is fairly low. The Wester is well armored for a tier 6 carrier. If I can get onto the target, I'll make mincemeat of him, but it looks like my allies are going to score the damage first, and that will be the match, with a nice screenshot scorecard of the Stukas descending upon an exploding target. And I am partially flag stacked, so you'll note pretty good income. But anyhow, 128,000 damage, with 12 torpedo hits, 13 bomb hits, 23 planes shot down by hull, 12 interdicted by fighter, 7 incapacitations, 2 kills, 4 fires, 1 flood, 10 citadel hits, 5 spotting ribbons, 33 rocket hits for a air defense expert, confederate, and high caliber. Team score wise, 2,000 base experience, so some significant weight on my shoulders, but we were able to carry it across the finish line. If we go to the detailed report, the bulk of my damage is going to be from HE bombs, but a pretty even distribution. All of the armaments, when used applicable at the appropriate situations, are fairly good. And you can see not so much damage in terms of dots, even with the good fire chance. Just because you only drop 2 bombs at once, you tend not to get too much fire damage, unless you're fairly lucky. So fire damage can be kind of swingy. Torpedoes, on the other hand, are also German, so yeah, unfortunately they don't flood very frequently. Now captain-wise, I am using my Graf Zeppelin captain, but as I mentioned, this is more of a traditional carrier. So because she has slow torpedoes, unlike the rest of the tech tree line, the tech tree line goes air supremacy into plane speed into armor and survivability expert, but the Loewenhardt actually does want the torpedo acceleration, just like the Graf Zeppelin. So you want to take these 9 skills instead and then go back for plane speed. After that, go for sight stabilization. Normally you don't take sight stabilization on the Graf Zeppelin. This is the captain for my Graf Zeppelin. But the tech tree carriers and the Loewenhardt would greatly appreciate having sight stabilization, so my anticipation is that you should take this skill next. So you might actually even want to go 9 points into sight stabilization into plane speed. So 9, 13, 15, and then last but not least follow with concealment expert. Her concealment is already pretty good stock though, so if you don't care about concealment, you could go back to AFT, but the secondaries, as I mentioned, don't have the improved formula. So it doesn't make them that impressive. Anyhow, it would be lovely to put in another game for you, but for now that's going to just be our initial impressions of the Erich Loewenhardt. So she is a bit of a Saipan-esque tier 6 carrier, unlike the Ark Royal, which is kind of like the exact opposite concept, which is a bit like a tier 6 Kaga. She plays like a tier 6 Saipan. However, unlike the Saipan, which suffers from having pretty difficult matchmaking and very tiny reserves at a tier that can be very punishing, the Loewenhardt is at a slightly easier to play tier, and so when you're top tier like that, or even when you're bottom tier as well, the combination of HE bombs and pretty decent torpedoes and decent rockets makes the Loewenhardt a extremely powerful carrier in the right hands. I'm not done testing the Loewenhardt yet, but my initial impressions are that she is an exceptionally powerful carrier, and so more than worthy of her position. She doesn't do the biggest alpha damage and doesn't have the most impressive damage of any of her one particular weapons, but all of them are very consistent when used properly, and that consistency is what makes her a gem in my books. Anyhow, with that said, that'll be all for now. I hope you enjoyed my initial impressions on the new Erich Loewenhardt, and I will catch you all later. Cheers.